Welcome to 1.7 Multiplying Integers. I wanted to start this conversation off by what this sign in front of the 4 actually means. This will help us to understand why, when we're multiplying integers or any rational number that's negative, why we have the outcome or the product that we do. So first of all, many of us have learned that this symbol in front means negative, which is true. It is negative. It tells us what side of the 0 it's on. In the past, when you saw that sign, before you learned about integers, you saw that it meant minus, to subtract, something along those lines. It also has a third meaning, which you've seen and probably used but haven't really realized on its own, and that is opposite. This is the opposite of 4. So anytime we see this negative sign or minus sign, it's also telling us it's the opposite direction from 0, so left, or the opposite of something. And so in this case, if I were to ask you the opposite of 5, all that would mean is put a negative sign in front of it. It's going to be on the opposite side of the 0. So here we have negative 5. Over here we have 5, positive 5. So opposite's really important as we're starting to understand multiplying. We've dealt with multiplying before, 7th grade and 8th grade. But again, as we come back to this, what we're really looking at is now a deeper understanding of multiplication, of saying, now I'm dealing with something that I had before. What does it mean now that I put it into the context of rational or negatives, where I can go to the left of the number line or of the 0 on the number line, in addition to just staying on the right or in whole numbers. So let's take a look at a very simple example. So the first one is 5 times negative 5. Or better yet, let's even go back a step here to say 5 times positive 5. So multiplication is a shorthand, and almost like a shortcut to multiple steps of addition. So here we're saying we have 5 5s. So we could also say 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5. So my goodness, we could do that, but a lot of us have memorized this shortcut, this shorthand, to say, I know I have 5 groups of 5. So together that's going to make 25. Well, in the past they've always been positive groups of 5. Now we could possibly have a negative group of 5. So going back to the first one I wrote, 5 times negative 5, that's doing the same thing, but now we're replacing this with a negative. So, or its opposite. So 5, negative 5 plus negative 5 plus negative 5 plus negative 5 plus negative 5. Is that right? No, that's too many 5s. So here we have the same number of 5s. We have 5 of them, but this time it's negative. So in the end, we have negative 25. So we have that as our first, a positive times a negative is going to give us 5 groups of whatever we were multiplying. In this case, we're multiplying 5, negative 5. So we're going to end up with a group of negative 5 because every time we're adding these together, like we talked about with addition and subtraction, they're going in the same direction. They're going farther and farther left on the number line. So what happens if we have this negative times a negative? A lot of you guys have seen this and heard this before, but we're coming back to it with a little bit of a twist. So let's take a look at first what an opposite of an opposite looks like. So before we talked about negative 4 being the opposite of 4. Well, what's the opposite of negative 4? Doesn't that take us back to positive 4? So the opposite of an opposite is really just the original value in the same direction. So if I were to think about this on a number line, here's my 0. I'm at 4. So the first opposite tells me to go back, or I should say, to negative 4. So the first opposite tells me to do that. The second opposite then says, well, take the opposite of this. So doesn't that just send me right back to where I started? So the opposite of an opposite really is just positive. And we could do that over and over and over again. So let's do it one more time. If I said, let's say negative or opposite of the opposite of the opposite of 4, kind of gets a little confusing as far as the notation goes. But let's look at that on the number line. Here's my 0. We'll start with 4, because then we're going to say that's the opposite of. So the first one here, so opposite, there we go, -4. And then if we do the opposite again, it tells us, well, go back over, opposite again, and then let's say one more time. So one more opposite. Well, right back. So in the end, it takes us to a negative value on the negative side of 0. So depending on how many opposite signs we have, kind of tells us where we're going to end up on the number line. It's going to be the same distance, so the multiplication, the process of multiplication doesn't change. It's just a matter of where you ending up. And so when we have something such as -5 times -5, well, that's simply our 5 groups of 5, but now we have a negative and another negative. So that's saying the opposite of this value. Well, 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 still tells us this equals 25. But then we have the opposite, so that would be -25. But we're taking the opposite of that as well. So opposite and the opposite of that, well, that takes us right back to a positive. So in the end, our answer is 25, positive 25. Let's take a look at a couple quick ones then. 6 times -5 times 3. Well, we can take this in any part we want. Multiplication, there's no order that's specific, and that's due to the commutative property, or even in some cases the associative property. So I'm going to do 6, or I'm going to use 6 and -5 first. So 6 times -5, well, multiply normally, we have 30. The opposite of that, because we have one negative there telling us the opposite of that value. So I'm going to be going to the left of the 0 to -30, and then I'm going to multiply this by 3. So in essence, I'm saying -30 plus -30 plus -30, and that's going to take me to -90, and then I'm done. Now if I had more negatives here, so if I had 3, let's make 3 negative, -3 times 6 times -6, well, in this case I'm going to multiply normally. Let's do 3 times 6 first, or you could do 6 times 6, doesn't really matter. So I'm going to have 18. This is going to be negative. Then I'm going to multiply it times another negative. So here's where we have that same issue. So here's an opposite, and here's an opposite. The opposite of an opposite then makes this positive. And if you don't know what 18 times 6 is, there's a couple ways that you could go about doing this. Here's one strategy. You could do it in the building form, such as you probably learned, or you could use a simple trick of saying, well, I know 18 is 10 plus 8, and well, 6 is being multiplied with the whole thing, and I know that if I add 10 and 8 together, that's going to equal that. So that's the same as saying 6 times 10 plus, well, 6 times 8. So I know 6 times 10 is 60, and I know 6 times 8 is 48. Well, I can do that in my head. 60 plus 40 is 100, plus another 8, 108. So in the end, I have a positive 108 because I had an opposite of an opposite being multiplied, which therefore takes me back into the positive, just like I was showing you on the right over here. If you have any questions, bring them to class tomorrow and we'll discuss them.